Thank you for joining us for the first event in our 2022 Artists in Conversation series, Contemporary Storytelling in Classical Music. Today, I am honored to introduce Katherine Goforth, who will be presenting her lecture, Trans 301, What Transitioning Means to Me and How It Can Transform Opera Making. Ms. Goforth is a prize-winning vocalist known for sharing her, quote, noble, colorful, and iridescent vocal sound, end quote, in strong and heartfelt performances. Some of her recent work has taken her to the International Opera Studio of Opera Köln, Portland Opera, Seattle Opera, Opera Theater Oregon, and Lark Opera, as well as concerts with the Oregon Symphony, the Portland Chamber Orchestra, and more. Goforth is an instructor of voice at Clark College in Vancouver, Washington, and teaches at Lydian Music Studios here in Portland. Katherine, welcome.
Thank you to Renegade Opera for inviting me to speak today, and I will just get right to it. I'm excited to be in conversation with you all, and I look forward to the chance for all of us to speak together after I've spoken. So, welcome to Trans 301. That title is just a little joke about trans activism. When I see advertisements for these kinds of conversations about trans issues, the program is almost always the same. Who to follow on social media and what organizations to donate to, what even is transgender, what's the most pressing legal issues facing trans people right now, and above all, what are pronouns and how do we use them? That's all content that I would call 101. It's introductory, like a first term class for non-majors. What I want to offer instead is third or fourth year trans thinking, a 300 level class, not just stating the rules of engagement when cis and trans people interact, but analyzing systems of oppression and offering a perspective on what to build in their place. If there are things that I say that are unclear, I'll be happy to clarify my thoughts or answer questions at the end. But what I want to model in my sharing today is a belief I feel more and more strongly about, that we need to use the space we have to be fully ourselves, even when we aren't fully understood. That's what my transition means to me, to be fully myself, no matter violence, no matter rejection, no matter what. I want to start with what you think you know from your introductory lessons on transness. The most visible and best funded LGBT activism revolves around the idea that people who happen to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender are just the same as you, the cisgender heterosexual audience that gets to decide if we receive legal rights or not. This is exemplified by the phrase love is love. Since homosexual love is just like heterosexual love, this strategy claims, and since therefore homosexual people are just like heterosexual people, we don't pose any threat to the way things are. Instead, LGBT people and their ways of life, contrary to what you've been previously told, fit in perfectly to the existing dominant culture. You have nothing to fear and no reason to vote against us. While love is a statement used to talk about partnership rights, much of trans activism today follows the same logic. Trans people want to use the bathroom, just like you. Trans people want to play sports, just like you. While these two statements are true, the function of this argument is to construct an image of transgender desire that is indistinguishable from cisgender desire, and therefore the idea in the shared social and political consciousness that transgender people are essentially normal. Normal, meaning that, contrary to what you've been told, trans people actually already fit within the context of our existing social structures. There's nothing to worry about with the presence of a transgender person within a cisgender workplace, a cisgender bathroom, or cisgender sports team. Because this strategy argues, you should see trans people as essentially cis. Why do we believe that it is necessary for queer people to erase their differences in order to live without threat of violence? Is this even a logical strategy to pursue? Who does it serve? Let us imagine a world in which queerness has been perfectly assimilated into systems of cisgender, heterosexual patriarchy. Let us imagine we have achieved a cishet queerness. The violence of the state and violence from other members of society must now be enacted by the queer person themselves, rather than an external restriction enforced by police or bullies or families or others. I must enforce the rules of this new queerness on myself. What happens if I fail? What happens if I step outside the box of acceptable queerness? This is what I mean when I say that this is no liberation. This is no different than the self-enforcement I performed at 12 years old, walking through the halls of my middle school, chanting to myself in my head that I could not be gay so I wouldn't go to hell. I'm very concerned with the establishment of norms within the broad community of queer people. While the fantasy I described above might seem absurd, these debates are already common. You may notice that I've changed the word I'm using here. Queer is my personal term, my self-identification, a word that offers the possibility of fluidity, that collapses the boundaries between so-called sexuality and gender and sex, and can be used to refer to a variety of individual experiences. In some ways, queer is a resistance to the idea of pinning oneself down. It is also both a political and an academic term, a way of thinking together and sharing our thoughts and recognizing our shared struggle and working together for mutual support. Earlier, you heard me use the phrase LGBT, which comes out of language that was used to talk about queer people in dominant culture media in the 20th century. This phrase is quite different because its explicit intention is to make clear definitions of groups, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, and to make clear divisions between them. Lesbians are not gay men are not bisexual. At one time, the formalized or institutional fight for gay rights was called the homophile movement. The word gay became typical later on, both in the context of gay liberation and of gay men, an identity group or a community linked by behavior. Eventually, gay men evolved into gay men and lesbians, a phrase that occasionally included reference to bisexuals. The order to the words was flipped to put lesbians ahead of gay men as a critique of patriarchy, and eventually trans people, previously referred to as transvestites in reference to socially deviant behavior, transsexuals in reference to socially deviant bodies, or simply as drag queens and drag kings, was tacked on to the end with the word transgender, which I've read was first used in the 1970s but didn't come into common usage until much later. LGBT, the phrase, exemplifies the practice of assimilation, which is why I use it in reference to mainstream activism. To me, LGBT already is cisgenderized, heterosexualized queerness. It was adopted as a political strategy, a more comfortable way for a conservative society to refer to us. Today, anyone can say those letters without hardly having to think about the people or practices that they represent. I want to return to thinking about norms within queerness. For example, how do we establish norms? One way is through contact with dominant culture. There's a famous trans woman whose name I'm not going to mention because this is not a critique of her, but a critique of a system. This person has worked as a model and actress. Over time, her appearance has become more and more conventionally attractive and cisgender. She's mentioned having multiple surgeries, which is definitely part of her getting more work or continuing to get work. What I want to say is first, her transition is absolutely valid, and I fully support her getting things that she needs. And I truly am happy for her. And her transition tells a story that looking cis is desirable, that looking cis defines the success of your transition and correlates with your success in your career and your life overall. This creates a norm for trans people of, well, she's famous, she's successful, this is something to aspire to, as well as a norm for people who are outside of transness looking in, that this is what it means to be a trans woman. This is the definition of transness. This is what a transition is supposed to look like. One person alone doesn't construct a norm, but when I think about the most highly visible trans people, the vast majority of them are people who either do or can fit into the expectations dominant culture has for public performances of gender, which is certainly not true of the broad community of trans people as a whole. That word public matters too, because someone can be a revolutionary in the privacy of their own house, but that's very different from doing it in public, from being seen existing outside of dominant culture. We're starting to hear this phrase more frequently. Visibility is a trap. Normally, what people mean is if you make yourself visible as a trans person, but don't have material protection or safety, then all your visibility has done for you is expose you to violence. But I want to interpret this phrase in a second way and say visibility is also a trap in terms of trans visibility establishes norms for trans people, norms that will never be universally accessible, as they are indeed not universally accessible to cis people. While representation matters, I want to add to that phrase and say the question to me isn't simply do we have any representation, but who are the specific people that are being made visible by the dominant media, and why those people? And what is the impact of their representation? What happens to trans people who can't or don't want to fit into the norms that their visibility establishes? For a trans person, assimilation into dominant culture is simply to change roles within that system, to move from dominator class to dominated class or vice versa. And generally speaking, only those two options. Although this model of transition can alleviate the pain of being closeted or dysphoric, it is not enough to truly liberate. While the argument can certainly be effectively made that assimilationism has been a productive strategy for LGBT activism to enact, it is also true that this reaped equal benefit for all people in the different categories across the L, the G, the B, and the T. Even within each group, the impact has not been felt equally. While the normalization of same-sex loving and gender variant people to the dominant structures of cisgender heterosexual patriarchy have been effective at reducing certain forms of violence, including the violence of being barred from economic systems like marriage and the legal family, it is also true that it has most benefited those who most benefit from existing social structures, people who are white, rich, and male. A strategy of assimilation reveals a pessimistic attitude towards the fate of queer people in an anti-queer society. It addresses the ontological inability of Western societies to tolerate difference with resignation. We will not be able to make this society change. We will not be able to exist as we are. Our only hope for survival is to become as much like this society as we possibly can. Maybe this outlook is realistic, or maybe it reflects the biases of those leading and paying for LGBT activism. Either way, it's not the strategy that I would choose. I have not transitioned publicly in order to move from one box to another, but as said, to be more fully myself. Although I want to make a living and one day buy a house and perform, what I found myself unable to tolerate is a life lived by the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal values of our dominant culture. I don't like that version of myself, either how I felt inside or how I treated others. This is not to say that I live perfectly today, but rather that acting in accordance with my own values, rather than the values of dominant culture, is the thing that has given me freedom and that continues to free me. This is the point at which I want to begin to address opera and classical music. We don't often think of it this way, but we have a great deal of activism around music as well. The socio-political image that we most often try to construct is the idea that music is universal, or a universal language. The critique is almost too obvious. Concepts of universality are expressions of culture and power. We rarely apply an ethnomusicologist's lens to so-called classical music, but for those of us that were formed by European or post-European culture, it can help us construct another image of what this music essentially is. For example, European classical music was first developed as a form of religious expression by members of the Catholic Church. The music is constructed from Christian theological values, like the creation of the triad, three voices sounding together to make one chord as a representation of the Christian Holy Trinity, or the association of a forbidden interval with the Christian embodiment of evil. The ways that melodies of Gregorian chant were constructed represent ideas about the proper recitation of the Bible and appropriate ways to use the voice and use music in church spaces. European classical music was developed by those with power, whether within the church or without. Many political rulers had their own composers who wrote music as propaganda and or entertainment for them, according to their tastes and values. Topics could be banned from performance when they expressed anti-church or anti-state ideology. Many of the rhythms of European classical music come from European art and folk dance, whether these are purposely developed, like the court dance rhythms of French Baroque opera, true folk dances like the jig or the waltz, or Orientalist appropriations like the falsely Turkish or falsely Romany music that we hear from composers of all levels. In other words, this sort of perspective shows us that European classical music is not universal, but an expression of the dominant religious, political, and social values of European cultures during a particular time. These ideas exist on all levels of this art form, whether they are personal expressions of values like the social and economic critique of dominant culture in The Marriage of Figaro, or reflections of implicit beliefs about race, nationality, and gender, like the pedagogical characterizations of Tamino, Pamina, Sarastro, Königin, Papagino, Papagina, and Monostatos in The Magic Flute. Although I don't want to spend much time on this point, I want to be clear that this perspective applies not only to the visual image making that these characters and stories do, or to the text that these characters speak, but to the composition of the music itself. One amazing source for looking into this is Y. Allen Brooks' Rhythmic Gesture in Mozart, which deconstructs every time signature and rhythm in both Figaro and Don Giovanni for their ideological content. As further reading, I recommend other musicologists using topic theory, especially Leonard Ratner and Kofi Agawu. I want to make this very clear. These aren't just things we can see, they are things we can hear. Every instrument, every rhythm, voice type, melody carries not just emotionally expressive meaning, but expressions of ideology. Some time ago, I had a conversation with a friend about a problematic opera rehearsal. That person asked me, "What do you love about making your art? How can you refocus on your art making?" I wasn't sure what to say. When have we ever gotten to make art in opera? I asked. That this music developed out of European dominant culture means that all aspects of our participation in it, whether creating it, rehearsing it, performing it, discussing it, studying it, or experiencing it, tend to reflect those same values, including its underlying orientation towards difference. I'm anxious to say this next part out loud. But if I answer honestly, I would have to say that the practice of opera making is one of the most oppressive practices that I've experienced in my life. The rehearsal room is a place that is saturated with power and power struggle. It is a place where few of us are allowed to be ourselves. It is a place where it is not possible for artists to have conversations, because it is a place in which disagreement is rarely tolerated and dissent is not tolerated at all. It is a microcosm of the history of imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal power. To me, the practice of art making is a practice of freedom, because I think that art is more than simply working within a form that has been defined as art by power, the way that music, dance, and theater are. I think art has to do with self-expression. If artists are prohibited from expressing themselves, then they are not functioning as artists. There are millions of kinds of self-expression, so it doesn't automatically mean telling you something personal about myself or putting an element of real life into my performance. The way that I would choose to sing a phrase is an example of self-expression. Why do I interpret the music in that way? It's something about me, and singing it that way is a way of sharing something about myself. As time passes, it's getting harder for me to be in a space in which I'm not allowed to be myself, because for me, that's what transition is about. Power over the self, the power to self-determine. The more I exercise that power over my own life, the more I change and the more painful it is to go back to how I was used to acting before. Since 2020, we've heard many performing arts organizations say that they will make room for everyone. But if what they really mean is people of any identity group can participate as long as they conform to our values and our way of doing things, then they offer nothing but business as usual. Another myth that I think comes out of arts activism is the idea that arts organizations as a whole are doing something different than dominant culture is. We have a lot of rhetoric about being progressive people within the arts and creating inclusive environments where we imagine a better way to live than the rest of society. I'd like to end today by expressing my vision of how a better way might look. The first thing that I would do is acknowledge the presence of difference in the room. And part of acknowledging difference is acknowledging power. If we want to meet each other in the presence of difference and want for difference to exist, but not to signify, then we have to find a way to meet as equals. I feel that in many cases we define equality as having the same rights, but I would frame it differently, that we are equal when we have the same power. That means the same power to self-express, the same power to self-define, the same power to say no, the same power to disagree. It may seem as though it would be impossible to work in these conditions. Wouldn't everyone disagree all the time? I don't think so. I think it would mean that we start in a different place. How do you understand the character? How do you want to play the scene? How do you want to interpret the phrase? In other words, how can we build this interpretation together? How can I support you? What do you need to practice your art? What is our real goal when we make opera together? How can our rehearsal practices support that goal? What if our mutually shared goal was not to meet the singular vision of an individual, but to empower each performer to give the best performance that they can? That's like transition. I can't possibly do it alone. I need help. But most of all, what I need is not external power to change me from one thing into something else, but to build the inner strength to outwardly embody the fullness of who I am. Certainly, we would still have conflict and disagreement. Then we would have to ask, how do we resolve disagreements without using power? The process of making art as a group is a kind of organizing and mobilization. Can we match each other's commitment? Can we build unity across our disagreements? Can we find another way to do things that satisfies us both? How would we define unity? For me, I think about our concept of vocal blend. In order to blend our voices, we're often asked to change the way we sound, to take out the distinctive qualities until all of us sound alike. When we sing in unison, we sound like one voice, not because we've come together to create unity, but because we've erased everything distinctive about ourselves. Instead, blend can mean that we match our vowels and our declamation of the words so that everything can be clearly heard, and then we sing with the fullness of our own voices exactly as they are. This is certainly a different kind of sound, a different kind of unison, and that's what it should be. If our art making practices aren't practices of freedom, then they should change. What makes this kind of performance beautiful isn't its conformity, but its uniqueness. When I sing with you, that will create a unique blend as our voices make a sound that only the two of them together can, based not on the reduction of us both, but on our full becoming. I spent most of my life thinking that while the rules of gender might break for others, they would never be able to break for me. The longer I endure, the more I see that I was wrong. What I thought was an external system holding power over me was at least in part rules that I was upholding for myself. When I decided to break them, they were finished. The ways that we make art together are no more than rules, and they too may only exist inside of us. They too, if we wanted, could break. And now I would love to open up for questions and conversation. Um, if you want to talk about or ask questions about trans topics more generally, I'm open to that. And I look forward to hearing what everyone has to say. Thank you so much.
Yay! Thank you so much, Catherine. That was beautiful. So, so thoughtful, so thought provoking. Do people have questions they want to like? Here, let me change my view really quickly so we can get more faces. Does anybody feel like they want to ask a question? Do we have questions in the question zone? Elliot, do you see things? Do you want to chime in and
Yes. There's one question in the question zone, which is mine. um, yeah, Catherine, I really loved how like beautiful and thoughtful and yeah, your talk was, and how much perspective you gave us. Um, I have a couple questions. The one that I've written down is, could you just remind us which musicologists you recommend for further reading?
Yeah, I recommend musicologists from Topic Theory. The founder was called Leonard Ratner. Ratner. And then two people who came later are Y. Allenbrook, spelled W-Y-E, and Kofi Agawu.
Thank you so much. And I haven't really, eloquently developed this question in my brain, but I was wondering, because the tradition of opera is so like rooted in gender, and the language of opera is so rooted in gender. I was wondering how you feel about like Fox and the way that we like continue to say like soprano, mezzo soprano, baritone, tenor, bass, etc. Like in as opera moves forward, do you feel like we have to abandon those terms and all the connotations that come with them, or do you see a way to move forward with them, or generally just your thoughts about moving forward with like classical opera tradition?
I think to some extent there is possibility to abandon Fox, and to say maybe these categories are too rigid. I think also that can go really wrong, where you just simply can't hear the singer's voice anymore because they're misfach, or they heard themselves because they're misfach. So I think I, I I do think that's kind of complicated. I mean, for me, like I'm really into using vocalists right now. Um, that just feels more gender affirming for me. But oh, hi, Maddie. Um, I, I think in general, the names of the category aren't the issue. I think in general, the issue is that we have a certain idea of how all characters must be played by all people. And at the same time, okay, so I'm going to struggle a little bit to put my words together on this, because at the same time, we also have this idea that, especially in America, that we're not doing character types. We're still doing self-expression, but your self-expression should find a way to fit into a box. Does that make sense? So I feel like that's one of the places to expand. You know, my take on masculinity is like probably different than someone else, but it doesn't have to just be that. Like my take on loving could be different, for example. And I don't feel like there's a lot of room for that in opera. Um, that my way of loving and the other person's way of loving and how we depict that on stage could show up maybe in a different way um, than maybe the director or the conductor or whoever is expecting. That's sort of how I would answer that question, or how I would approach that. I don't think the names of the category are necessarily the issue. I think it's more about how they limit our imagination.
Great, thank you so much. I noticed that there's a question in the Zoom chat from Ivy Barr. Have you experienced any rehearsal rooms so far that are similar to the concept you've shared?
I mean, the ones that I'm in charge of. I mean, I've done my best when I've been in a situation where I'm doing directing. Like, I'm still really working out sort of my ideas on this, but this is the framework that I'm trying to move towards. And I would say I do a lot of this in my teaching. I really ask my students questions incessantly. And it's kind of like the entire lesson is kind of asking questions. Like whatever I tell them to do is like within the context of those questions. Um, what do you feel? Why did you sing it like that? How do you want to sound? Did you feel this? Did you feel that? I had some really bad experiences of like my my voice hurting a lot in lessons, and like saying so to the teacher, and the teacher being like, just keep doing it, it sounds fine, and so I that's sort of where the asking questions came to me, came from for me. But it's this idea of like the autonomy of the student, and helping them to develop their idea of what they want. Yeah. In terms of professional, or like where I was the actor or something like that, I'm going to say no comment on that one. I am going to say I have one teacher in particular who taught me this way, and that was really transformative for me.
Can I ask a follow-up also? Cool. I didn't realize you directed. What do you do in your rehearsal room specifically to help decentralize that power? To help like kind of collaborate it better?
Yeah, I mean, I like to try to ask questions there also. I mean, you really have to ask the people who were in that show, like how they felt about it, and how effectively they felt I did it. So I'm not going to say that I was perfect or anything, but for me, I tried to be asking questions and saying things like, how would you like to do it? Or how would you interpret this? Or I would like you to make such and such a movement. How would you do it? Um, or talking about interpretation, how would you like to interpret that phrase? Or just being open to changing the ideas a lot. I think for me, one of the baseline things is not having an overall concept. This is how it has to look at the end, but allowing that to continue to grow throughout the entire rehearsal process. I would say, yeah, that's really important to me.
There's another question in the question zone. Have you seen As One the opera, and what were your thoughts on
No comment.
it? I think I saw that with you. Did I? I can't remember. Maybe not.
I don't think I've seen that one live. So that's another
Okay.
reason I
Okay.
shouldn't make any comments.
Okay.
I have a question. And you sort of spoke on it already, but I wondered if you would elaborate on the the idea that that would take forever. Like if we gave everybody in the rehearsal room the opportunity to answer these questions and to be asked these questions, that it would take forever. And so lots of folks who have been educated in the classical opera, Western opera production system are like, that's impossible. What do you have like? I don't know. Would you speak a little more on that? I think,
I
yeah.
actually wrote a whole section about education that I then cut out because it was a little bit away from the main thesis I was trying to make. But it's like, what did we get out of our education? Was we got 4 years or 6 years or more than that years of people telling us how to be submissive to power and how we would ruin our careers and ruin our lives if we didn't just do what other people told us all the time. And so I feel like there's a really great opportunity to change the training, that that the sorry, see that now I lost my train of thought. But I think we have really a great opportunity to change that. So what could we be thinking of instead, right? Like we could be thinking of how to ask people questions so that they can develop their interpretations. You know, um, yes. I'm just gonna let me just pull up my notes. I hope my face doesn't go away. Let me see if I can find that really quickly. Yeah, because I did think, on the one hand, it seems like it will take a lot of emotional regulation, but it's like, why does it, why would it take emotional regulation in the first place? In other words, why are people getting emotionally dysregulated over a loss of power in the first place, over a loss of control over the other person, right? So it's like this question to me of why is the control over the other the essential part of our way of making art, you know? And so I think it has really a lot to do with letting go of control of other people and allowing other people to be themselves. Okay, that's also like a trans idea, right? Like that everyone gets, should get to express themselves how they want to. So yeah, I have so much to say about this topic really because there's such a difference between giving up autonomy under consent and giving up autonomy when you feel that you have to. And what we really have in the opera situation is a situation where we feel like we have to, and then we have to pretend that we're not even giving up consent. And so there's really several layers of power going on there. And that's why I think it all will take so much time. You know, when I'm in a situation, like I work a lot with women do, and when we're working together, there's really a lot of trust there that we both know what we're doing and how we want to do it, and that we can just rehearse and let things happen and explore the music together. As opposed to I'm trying to use all of you in the cast to make my mark and to get some good press. So I think it has a lot to do with assessing what each of our roles are in the rehearsal room, how we're treating other people, how we're wielding or not wielding power over others. Anyone?
Abby, did you have something?
Well, I keep thinking the word is ego, right? Like that's a word that it can mean so many different things, but eventually it comes down to, in order to come into rehearsal space, the ego has to be checked at the door, right? And has to become a collaborative space. And I don't know, it just seems like, why is that such a hard concept for singers or for directors or conductor? Like, why is that such a thing for them? And I'm not saying you have the answer or anybody has the answer on here, but that's what just keeps ruminating in my mind, is like, is this just that patriarchal, as you said, like opera's one of the most uh, you know, historically not fair practicing uh, art forms, right? And it just seems like there's so many of us who want it to change and want the ego to come out of it, want to be more collaborative. But do you think that we're just kind of fighting against these whistleblower, I don't know, these gatekeepers and etc. I don't know. That's not really a question. It's just like, it's all playing in my mind of like, ah, that's all.
I mean, it does definitely feel like a losing battle. So for me, I've just thought a lot about what are my values and what situations do I want to put myself in and what situations do I want to say no to. And just trying to match the situations that I'm into my values as much as possible, even if the long term of that means that my career takes a different trajectory and I have to figure out some other things to do. It's just more important to me at this point in my life to like be living out my values and the things that I do on it is to have success within any system. So that's kind of what I would say to
That's
that.
still success. That's
Well, you
still
can say that. You can say that.
I'm seeing a comment in the chat. Maddie says, shame on me if you already discussed this. But do you have a dream role or project? Is there an opera in the existing canon that you particularly want to take on as a trans vocalist?
I don't really know anymore, to be honest, because it's like my experience of each role keeps changing, especially lately, and it's like, what do I have the vocal temperament for? What do I have the emotional temperament for? And then what role is even comfortable when I put it on? And I would definitely say I'm in a little bit of a questioning space with that. I'm not really sure where that's going to wind up. I don't really have the potential to be singing in alto or mezzo, just the way that my voice is. So, or at least how it is right now. Okay, cross your fingers. So, but yeah, I'm not really sure. That's a good question. I mean, I should answer that so everyone can go hire me, but that's definitely an exploration for me, and that's a tough thing because, like we said earlier, it's not just embodying the roles musically, but the roles have an ideological content that sort of goes more deeply. For me, it's really like a soul level deep, or whatever we want to call that. And yeah, it's not that easy to put on.
okay. Follow-up question.
Yeah.
What about just what do you want to work on next? Like, is it more art song? Is it more musical theater? Is it new composers? Is it what? So if there's not a particular role, what is your dream next? Let's ask that question.
Yeah, I have I'm working on some projects right now for a new opera. I'm working on a project, hopefully cross your fingers, maybe a new musical. Um, and those are really great for me. And what I like about them so much is that it would be trans roles or transcoded roles or whatever, however you want to say it. So that's really wonderful. I definitely would say that like I love Leader the most. Like I just have to admit that I really love Leader, and I find that it fits my voice really well. I love singing in German. And what's great about singing song repertoire or orchestral repertoire is that it's not necessarily represented from a particular character's point of view. So those are a lot easier to put on. Yeah, it is a really tough question for me, because what I've gotten out of music for so long is that ability to self-express. where maybe I wasn't in other areas of my life. And so then it's like being more open, and then it's like my whole relationship to what I'm expressing, or even like what I need to express is different, if that makes sense. Used to be a lot angrier. I really like to sing really angry pieces, and that's much easier to do, like as tenor. And then it's like, okay, well, you change and your emotional life evolves, and then maybe you're attracted to different repertoire. And so I have to figure out what that means. It's been a really long pandemic, so it's like we're all just so different, priorities different and everything. So there's just there's so many questions. I can go on about this forever. So ask something else.
Sorry, I want to I want to jump on the art song bandwagon too, because that's where my mind went when Abby said that too. Something that really struck me while you were talking, Catherine, is um, it's it's not really democratizing the rehearsal room. It's like giving, which I heard in like a plenary lecture recently, and I was like, what does that mean? It's like um, giving everybody's self-worth and self-integrity space in the rehearsal room. And I feel like that's something that art song does because it's connection on an intimate level. And so I guess my next question is about like, what do you think about self-production or the idea of encouraging or equipping young singers from like their um their like bachelor's level to actually go out and put on their own recitals, put on their own small things so they can be self-realized even if their technique's not perfect and even if they don't entirely know who they are, like making our art form be something where you can find self-realization instead of preparing a recital and showing up in your teacher's like or
Mm. Well, I do think the teacher has a right to be like thumbs down if they really think there's a reason to. I think
yeah.
it's important for teachers to be honest on that. But I would also, I mean, I'm really suspicious of the whole entrepreneur thing. I think that's really just a way to be like, we don't have jobs for you, but we want you to pay for this education. And then, you go out and do your entrepreneur thing. And that's how we're going to justify putting you $100,000, $200,000 in debt. um, I think it's wonderful whenever people want to put on their own concerts and their own music. And I say, absolutely go for it. I think for young students, there's definitely a level of like competency that anyone needs. Like you don't want to lose your voice in the middle of a recital,
Yeah.
So you want to make sure you're not going to lose your voice before you do it. But then, yeah, sure. I mean, I don't think anyone's ever fully formed as an artist or as a person. I think that there's that, if you want it to be, can continue to be a process of evolution and self-discovery. So I guess what I would say is I have mixed feelings on that. But I do believe very strongly in the voice lesson and the voice training being a way to self-construct and to self-develop. And to me, that's part of asking questions, and saying, what do you think, to students who I have students who no one has ever asked that before in their life, maybe. And then that's not about me, but that's about confronting the question, what do I think? And then I think this instead of that, and it tells me something about who I am, you know, and why I'm doing something. When we know why we're doing things, we know what our values are and why those are our values, then it's much easier to stand in them and express them to others, even if they don't agree. So I guess that's what I would say about it.
Thank you. That's like exactly, you managed to wrap up the whole like problematic, make your art pay and like, but maybe you aren't ready for it yet and like tie a really nice bow on it because it goes back to really thinking about the pedagogy for young singers and not having it be like power centric pedagogy when we teach opera
Mhm.
or art song. I love
Or
that.
anything. I mean, we
Thank
don't
you.
have to teach
Yeah.
for a place of power. And it's like, why are we teaching for a place of power? Why is it so important that that person becomes exactly like me? You know, what is that saying about me? What am I trying to enforce on them? So, anyone else?
Do we have any other questions? I mean, I could just keep talking your ear off all day. This is so wonderful. And it's so nice to see everyone on the call. Hi, Lindsay. Hi, Allison. Hi, Nicholas. Thanks for joining us. Hi, Carolyn. Yay. Well, do you have any final words of wisdom or thoughts that you want to leave us with today?
I'm not sure I had any wisdom. I just have, my point of view and just trying to be honest. So
So much
yeah,
wisdom.
thank you everyone so much for coming. It's really, it's my pleasure to speak for you. I'm just really grateful for the opportunity.